My parents banned me from the family cabin. They told me to my face that I was not welcome on the land where I'd spent every summer of my life, and they changed the locks 2 days later. That hurt because the cabin was not only wood and nails to me, it was the only place where my father ever let me be a person without the ledger of debts, the lists, and the quiet judgments. They took away a place where my grief fit, where my body remembered how to breathe in the right rhythm. They did it in a single, small, bureaucratic move. An email from my mother that said, "We can't have you here anymore." And then, 3 hours later, a text confirming the locksmith had been there. I learned to be furious with people. In the same sentence, I learned how to be afraid of losing what I loved. They did it because I refused to sign one more thing that would funnel money, our money, to the account they'd been padding for years. I won't pretend the money was everything. It mattered because it exposed the pattern. Their decisions always included a ledger where my name came out smaller. The ban was a performance of control. It said, loud and clear, "You do not get to make choices here." It was a betrayal that landed on a dozen small failures they'd already accumulated, dismissals, silences, a steady erasure. That's why it hurt. It was not just losing a place, it was having them declare that the person who belonged there no longer did. We were, on paper, a close family. My parents, Ruth and Harold, lived within an hour of the cabin in a town of fewer than 3,000 people. They'd bought the cabin in 1987 with Harold's savings from working the mill and a small inheritance from his sister. The cabin sat on a narrow point of land with pines on 3 sides and a wide, shallow lake on the other. It was a 2-room place, electricity from a battered generator for most of my childhood, and, later, a patchwork of solar panels my father fiddled with like a hobby that made sense to him. I grew up with the exact hours of my life: school in the winter, river in the summer, labour in the fields when I was 12, and legally old enough to sweep the walkways. My parents insisted on that structure. It made them feel safe. The power imbalance lived in small things. My mother handled almost every household bill and kept all the paperwork in a battered binder she called the account. She insisted she knew best because she had kept track of things: who paid what, where receipts were, how money should flow. My father deferred to her because he wanted the piece of a ledger he did not have to manage. They liked to say, jokingly at first, that they were the married accountants of the family. Later, the jokes had a sharper edge. I was the child who never quite earned their trust. I had student loans they liked to point at. I had a job they considered flimsy. I paid for things they thought extravagant, like a new roof patch for the cabin the winter my father's cough got worse. They filed the invoice under necessary repairs and then called me a few weeks later to insist I contribute to a family vacation I had not been invited to plan. Money mattered because I owed them in ways that were hard to label. I lived close enough to help when my father started having trouble with his knees, and for the first year I did not think of it as labour. I thought it was family. I drove an hour every Tuesday to pick up groceries and dropped off prescriptions. I fixed a leaky sink. I sat with my father while he told the same stories about the mill 2 times and then apologised for having to tell them again. My mother loved to remind me how small my own savings were, how unstable my work looked, and how a family could not survive if everyone pursued their own selfish things. Those reminders were not always sharp. They were the background music that set my life to an uncomfortable tempo. Keep showing up, keep giving, and do not ask for stakes. So when they banned me from the cabin, I could not simply walk away. I had built a life within their orbit. I was one of the people who paid attention to their paperwork even when they wanted to pretend they didn't need me. My name appeared on the tax notices 3 times over the last decade. Once because I'd paid a late county bill they missed. Once because I'd paid for a new septic line after the old one collapsed. And once because I was listed as caretaker on the land use form the county required for small rental properties. Each of those payments gave me leverage. Not much, but something. My leverage was a small collection of slips and invoices I had kept in a shoebox in the closet. I kept them like talismans. I had no legal training. I had no lawyer. But I had memory and records, and that would be important later. The first escalation came fast. After the locks changed, my mother started calling neighbors, telling anyone who would listen that I had become unwell, that I was making disparaging remarks, and that I was paranoid about money and ownership. She wanted to frame it as a protection story. She wanted to make my inability to accept their decision a kind of illness. A neighbor I had known since I was 8 answered the phone and told me about it. He was cautious in the way small town people are when you get into family fights. He didn't want to offend. He was also blunt enough to tell me my mother had asked him to stop me from walking down to the water. He apologized when he told me. The shame of being spoken about like that, not for something I did, but for who I was to them, was another cut. It left me feeling both isolated and exposed. I responded the only way I could. I drove to the cabin and knocked. There were prints on the door where the lock had turned. The porch chair I had refinished the summer before was inside under a tarp. I felt that same hollow ache. I called them. My father picked up and put the phone on speaker. They told me they'd made a hard decision. They told me I needed to take time away, to see a counselor maybe, to breathe without pressure. All of the lines were old. They were the kinds of words parents use to close a discussion while pretending they are offering help. The consequence of that weekend was immediate and practical. I had nowhere to sit and feel the lake at dusk. The cabin was where I went to think with less fear. Without it, I was a person who knew how to survive, but who had fewer safe spaces. The situation worsened when my mother began withholding information. She would not tell me when the county taxes were due. She would not answer which insurance company still had the policy on the property, even though the premium notices went to the house where she lived. When I asked, she said she'd handle it. When she handled it, my name did not appear on any receipts. A second escalation arrived in the form of financial pressure. My father's knees got worse mid-September, and I drove out to check on him. He needed more frequent care, pills, doctor visits. I offered to chip in. My mother said, "We'll call you if we need anything." Then, a week later, she texted me a family bill, $3,200 for a new stair lift the house needed for Harold's safety. She sent it with an expectation. The tone implied that I was one of the people who should cover it. I could not refuse and keep my dignity. I also could not pay that without dipping into my rent money. I paid $500 toward it because I had to. I took the next month's groceries on credit. The payment was small in the math of it, but large in the ledger of relationships. It kept me tied. The cost of participating meant I was poorer, yes, but more importantly, I was more dependent. Betrayal multiplied. At the community meeting in October, someone mentioned that my parents had been telling a different version of events to the county. They were saying I'd refused to accept family help, that I had tried to take ownership of the cabin away from them. I remember how my stomach folded when I heard that, because it reframed the narrative in the wider public sphere. In a town like ours, reputation organizes practical aid. When your reputation bends under accusations, services change hands. People began to answer my calls with the same cool distance. The friends I thought I had turned cautious. One of them told me we don't want to be in the middle. It felt like being erased in slow motion. I tried to use the small document trail I had, the receipts, the text messages, the photographs of the porch chair before it was tarped. I sent them a certified letter asking for clarification of the decision, for a timeline and an explanation. My mother responded with email that was 3 sentences long and a photograph of a sealed envelope addressed to the county. "We took care of necessary business," she wrote. "You are still family, but you need to step back for now." The photograph was the escalation. It suggested legal action without showing any proof. Suggestion can be as powerful as action, and for a moment I felt the ground shift. When the ground shifted, I lost a bit of myself. The low point came not in a single scene, but as a slow, cumulative diminishing. I missed a rent payment because I had paid that $500 and another $300 sending a package of medications north. My landlord started to call. I took an extra shift at work and cried in the car afterward because I could feel my body balancing on money. Friends were less empty-handed. They were practical now, not emotional. I felt trapped, not by one person, but by a network of small betrayals that made freedom expensive. The cabin, the place that had been a refuge, became a symbol of everything I had to fight for and could not. At the worst of it, I had a moment that was quiet and heavy. It was a Tuesday night. The rain tapped the windows, and I held a photograph of the 3 of us at the cabin the summer before. My father with his arm around me, my mother laughing with sunscreen on her nose. I tried to picture a way back to that image. There was no accessible route. My parents had arranged the world so that my presence felt like an intrusion and my absence like the better option. The feeling was not dramatic. It was a small, steady grief that sat behind the ribs and made sleeping impossible. I felt abandoned and defeated. I had given and been given little in return, and the ledger was not in my favor. The turning point came because of an unexpected, almost inadvertent piece of paper. I had been shuffling through the shoebox of receipts one week, looking for anything that would tell me where the county property tax notices were going. It was the sort of search that you do when anger is wearing a groove and you obey it because you need to get somewhere. In the middle of the box, folded and brittle, was an old deed, a county clerk's copy from 1993. So it listed the land as being held as tenancy in common between Harold J. Crane and me, Elena M. Crane. My name was properly printed on the scanned copy. I stared at it for a long time until the letters clarified into a story I could not yet understand. I did not know why the deed was there. I did not know why my name was on it. I only knew that the thing I had lost might be claimable. I took the deed to the county office. There is a slow, small bureaucracy that both calms and terrifies. The clerk who helped me was thorough, older, and used to the kind of families with complicated land histories. He photocopied the deed, cross-checked the dates, and told me, without dramatic emphasis, "This says you have an interest in this property." He said the technical language, tenancy in common, and what it meant in straightforward terms. Each tenant owns a percentage that can be transferred, sold, or encumbered separately unless there's a restrictive clause. There was no such restrictive clause in the copy I held. My heart beat with a brittle hope. I took the photocopy to a lawyer the following day. I had to. I had no experience with ownership beyond paying bills and mowing lawns. The lawyer was a small-town attorney who smelled faintly of coffee and paper. She read the deed and then read other records. "It appears your father transferred a portion of the property to you in 1993, she said. "He signed it. Your signature is on the deed, Elena." My signature. I remembered writing something in my mid-20s without thinking. A name slotted into a form because Harold wanted to include me as part owner. I recalled the afternoon, beer, a promissory note, a promise my father made in a way that felt like an easy thing. I had not thought it through then, and I had not had the funds to press my ownership. But there it was. The reality was cold and clear. I had a legal footing. The revelation shifted the power dynamic almost instantly, but the shift did not feel cinematic. It began with small decisional movements. I filed for a quiet title action to have the court recognize my interest officially. I demanded that my parents provide a copy of any document that demonstrated they had the right to exclude me. They produced nothing that altered the deed. The lawyer wrote letters. The landlord stopped calling. Someone on a local message board argued that I was doing the right thing by claiming what was mine. That chatter did not make the work easier. It simply made the path visible. The escalation that followed my action was louder. My mother called the county clerk and tried to challenge the validity of the deed. She claimed the signature was forged or that the form had been misrepresented. She came into the lawyer's office with Harold and a stack of receipts. They tried to present a narrative that they had been caring for my father and therefore had the moral right to decide who could be on the land. The legal system, which runs on documents and precedent more than moral claims, required more than feeling. The clerk looked at them as he had looked at me a week before, and then he turned to a large map and read out dates and parcel numbers. The law is not neutral to emotions, but it can be dispassionate in a way that slices cleanly through performative claims. When the judge signed an order recognizing my ownership percentage and granting me the right to possess my share, I felt something that was both triumphant and empty. It was a legal one-liner on a stamped page. Harold and Ruth received the notice because the court required service. They responded with panic. They called neighbours. They packed a few things into their car and said they would stay with friends while we sort out these legalities. I watched them leave the drive with 2 boxes and a blanket, as if this were a temporary exile. But I had learned that actions matter more than words. A paper order was necessary, but not sufficient. I did what the lawyer advised. I filed for a writ of possession. The county sheriff's office came on a quiet Tuesday morning with a deputy who had a soft voice and a gentle manner. He knocked on the cabin door. I stood back on the road and watched. There was no yelling. The deputy read the writ, and then, with the softness of someone used to the hard parts of people's lives, he explained what would happen next. My parents had 15 minutes, and then they would be asked to leave. They had the opportunity to gather possessions. What followed was not cinematic. There were no triumphant speeches or gloating. My parents' faces were flat, with a calculation I could not read. My mother's hands shook as she put a folded blanket into a box. Harold looked like he had been given the wrong map. They did not try to touch me. The sheriff's deputy asked me quietly if I wanted to be there when they walked off the property. I said yes because I wanted to see them leave. I wanted a closure that had nothing to do with desire for vengeance and everything to do with marking the end of an old, painful pattern. They left. The deputy helped move a dated recliner to the car. A neighbor who had been critical of me brought a hand truck and said, "We'll take it to the thrift store." The moment was ordinary and full of small human hands. Later that day, when the last box slid into the trunk and they drove away, I felt an immense, flat silence. The land was mine by law and by record, but the place did not feel immediately settled. The consequences rippled outward in ways I had not fully anticipated. First, the county demanded back taxes that had not been paid because my parents had set their accounts such that they assumed their portion would be covered. There were penalties and interest and a demand for $1,800 I had not budgeted for. I sold a few items I had kept in the attic to cover it. The legal fees were another burden. The lawyer had been frank about costs. I paid her in installments because she accepted the reality that justice is expensive. The sheriff had charged a fee for his time and the truck. I covered that too. Second, the relationship with my parents ended in a way that made reconciliation unlikely. They called twice in the months after the eviction. The first time my father left a message that sounded small and embarrassed. He said, "We should talk." The second time, my mother texted me a long list of grievances, how I had treated them, how I had disregarded their needs. I did not respond. I did not because responding felt like reopening a wound that had not yet closed. More practically, it felt like stepping into a conversation where I would be anesthetized by their insistence I was the problem. The relationship decanted into absence. Not the violent, dramatic kind, but the slow, bureaucratic kind that exists in missed holidays and unreturned calls. Third, there was social fallout. Some people in town thought I had been cruel. Others admired me. A handful of old friends declined to come to my small housewarming because they didn't want to anger my parents. People took sides the way small towns do, not with moral clarity, but with the stubborn preservation of convenience. I lost a small circle of acquaintances. I gained, oddly, a few people who saw the situation and offered practical help. Someone who could fix the generator, a retired carpenter who volunteered to help clear branches. The practical kindnesses stitched a new, fragile network that felt quieter than the old one. The emotional consequences were stickier. I had the land, but the cabin felt strange. Walking into a place where your history has a different presence is like reading a book you used to know by heart and finding a missing chapter. I spent mornings sitting on the porch, drinking coffee, and feeling guilty that I had used the law to force my parents away. I read their absence like a slow snowfall. At night, and I woke imagining them sitting on the neighboring porch at their new rental, talking low so the county would not hear. I told myself that the sheriff's visit had been about enforcing an order, not about punishment, but the feeling of being the cause of someone's homelessness, even if they had chosen the path that led them there, hung on me. Time changed the edges. 6 months later, my father sent me a photograph of the lake taken from the other side, the light low and the water glassy. No message. I sent back nothing. The moral clarity people expect after actions like mine did not arrive. There was no cinematic redemption. Instead, there were days when I went down to the water and sat alone. I fixed a broken window. I painted the trim. I paid the water bill on time. Small, responsible things. I did not become a fortress. I learned to tilt the porch chair toward the sun and to listen for the sound of the loons that returned in late spring. There were also realities I had to accept. Owning land is not the same as possession of peace. The cabin was mine, but it required maintenance and money. I applied for a small grant aimed at preserving historic structures. The cabin qualified because of its age and received a modest award that paid for new shingles. I learned how to mow around stones and the right way to seal a window. These were not romantic tasks. They were matters of survival. I found modest satisfaction in giving the cabin the care my father had once lavished on it, and that, in some ways, made keeping it less an act of ownership than a form of stewardship. The longer-term consequence which surprised me was the clarity that started to harden. I had been a person who softened around others' needs to avoid conflict. Owning that parcel of land and enforcing that ownership taught me a different kind of clarity. It was not the clarity of righteous triumph. It was the clarity of recognizing limits, where my responsibility ended, where my willingness to be useful could be exploited, and where I had to stand still. That recognition did not make the loneliness easier, but it made decisions cleaner. It changed how I spoke to people who wanted things from me. In the aftermath, I also watched how my parents adapted. They found a small, rented house in town that was cheaper. Harold took up woodworking again. Ruth began to volunteer at the library. They were not defeated in the dramatic sense. They kept living. I watched their lives play out at a distance. And sometimes I realized that I missed casual things. A cup of my mother's tea at some neutral cafe, a seasonal joke about the weather. Those things felt unavailable because the trust that made them possible had been spent. I had accepted the legal truth at a cost I had been willing to pay. A severe reduction of intimacy. The cabin changed too. I stopped pretending it was the exact same place. I kept the photo from that summer before everything broke. I placed it on the mantle. It was not a totem so much as an artifact of a life that existed in a different configuration. Sometimes I would look at it and remember the way my father used to hum under his breath when he sanded a chair. Other times I would just see the wooden frame and the way light fell through the pine boughs. The picture taught me that memory is not the same as permission. I could remember them fondly without letting them back in to re-establish patterns that had been painful. I do not tell this as a moral tale. I do not think land should solve the hard things between people. The sheriff's eviction was the tangible ending of a specific set of abuses. Exclusion, manipulation, financial pressure. It was a legal action that produced a legal result, and in that strict sense, it worked. But the human thing it opened was not a neat closure. It left a shoreline that needed tending. It left me responsible for a space full of history and ghosts. I had legal possession and a new loneliness. I also had a freedom that was, at last, not rented in the daily coin of favors. People have asked me since then if I regret it. The answer is complicated. I regret the way things broke because I had hoped for a less destructive path, but I do not regret protecting my right to a place that kept me steady for years. Protection is not always an act of defense against an outside enemy. Sometimes it is the only way to keep a little of yourself intact. The sheriff's presence felt mechanical and necessary. It was not satisfying in the way novels make revenge satisfying. It was dirty with paper and fees. It was quiet and administrative. It was also, in the simplest way, efficient. I go to the cabin now less often than I did when my parents were there. I go more as a person who is careful about weather and about the integrity of old wood. I plant a small garden on the south side and keep a notebook of repairs. I have friends who come with tools and stay for the soup I can make. I host less in the way of big family events. I host in the way of keeping a place where I can sit and listen. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, I stand on the dock and see the place where the maple leans. And I remember 1,000 small things about the history of a family. Those memories live alongside the legal facts now. They do not erase them. If I have a final thought, not a lesson to preach, but a thing I now say to myself in private, it is this: property can shelter you, but it cannot mend the invisible threads that tie people together. Owning the land meant I could protect the cabin from being used as leverage. It did not heal what had been broken between us. The work of reconciling, if it ever happens, will not be solved by a deed or a signature. It will be solved, if at all, by smaller, slower things, showing up without calculation, saying sorry enough times to feel true, and listening in a way that expects nothing in return. I do not know if that will happen. For now, I have the cabin. I keep it in order. I take the calls I want to take and set boundaries for the ones I do not. I sleep with the windows cracked in summer and the generator humming in winter. Sometimes I think of telling my parents to come back for a weekend. Mostly, I do not. Mostly, I let the quiet be its own answer. If this story resonated with you, please leave a like. If you want to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing. And if you've ever been cut out of a family place or had to claim something that was yours, I'd love to read your experience in the comments below.